Good morning, everyone. My name is Teodoro Ewan. I'm a student here at Utah Valley University. I'm in the accounting department. And today we are going to welcome you to the thematic session of Sustainable Goals, Development Goals, number 8 of Decent Work and Economic Growth, and number 9, Industry, Innovation, and Infrastructure. SDG 8 promotes sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. SDG 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. The moderator for this panel is Mr. Ben Kolender, former director of Salt Lake City Office of Economic Development. The panelists include Dr. Laura Muro. She is a professor of accounting and international business from the St. Louis University in Madrid. Mr. David Utrilla, CEO of U.S. Translations and Honorary Consul of Peru in Utah, and Dr. Sahar Rod, Professor of International Economics of the University of Westminster in London. As we will not have time for detailed introductions, please see their bios on the website under SDG 8 and 9. Now I'll turn the time to Mr. Ben Kolender. Thank you.
Thank you, Teo, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for those joining us here in the audience. We also have individuals attending it virtually, and I want to say thanks to those people as well. And also thank you to UVU and the UN for hosting such a wonderful conference. We've been here for 3 days now and just heard so many positive things and interactions and discussions taking place here. Thank you to Felipe and Baldomero as well for your organization of the conference. And thank you to these panelists that we have here, these wonderful panelists to speak on this topic. Really excited to be the moderator of this panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. One of the things just for the audience to think about while we're having our discussion is we're going to leave just a little bit of time towards the end, about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more. So if you're having questions, particular questions, write them down, think about them. Because we'll leave some time at the end to allow you to ask. And I just ask if you have a question to one particular panelist, be sure to direct it to them. If not, leave it open and we'll do our best to field the question here with the panel. So getting into SDGs 8 and 9, I want to ask the panel, share a personal perspective and then ask the panel to do the same. SDGs 8 and 9, you know, we see them on the 17 SDGs. We see the titles. We all do this work in different ways through business and economics and academia, and where those worlds merge together. And, you know, for me, I see these goals and I connect with them when thinking about a past life in Afghanistan. So I used to serve as a part of a task force in the US government to go in and work in Afghanistan. And what you realize really quickly through the work is oftentimes if you don't have decent work, other negative things can follow. You find a path that maybe isn't as economically productive or as safe, or maybe it can be filled more with anger. And infrastructure that allows innovation is important to see that economic growth and decent work as well. So this is why we see these two goals put together on this panel, in my opinion, and how I see it reflected in the work. And what I see in 8 and 9 is the interest and ability to see that human-centered economic development, I call it, through the masses and to the greatest extent possible. And so what I want to ask the panelists is, let's first go down 2 to 3 minutes each. Your work, a little bit of background, and you know, how you see yourself connecting with SDGs 8 and 9 through your work. Laura, let's start.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I am a professor. I am an educator and academic. I teach my students different diverse business disciplines, and I try to incorporate hardly the Sustainable Development Goals, 8 and 9, but also others as they are interconnected. And now I think it's absolutely important to develop curriculum innovation in different, all the different disciplines to incorporate sustainability. That's part of the education. But also, as a researcher, I like to research about sustainability issues, for instance, board gender diversity, how it affects, how it impacts the creation of value in corporations, the financial inclusion, and all these aspects of sustainability. I think the research part is also essential as you make all these topics visible internationally, and at the same time, you develop policy recommendations for changing the world for better.
That's great.
I've been in the translation and interpretation business for 27 years. Our company mission is to break language barriers. And those barriers are not just happening here in the United States, and English is not the only language in the world. In fact, it's not even the #1 language spoken in the world. But our industry is becoming more and more a technology industry. We were more a linguistic industry, but it's changing with the addition of machine translation, neuro machine translation, and AI. There are a lot of things that are helping translators and interpreters to be able to communicate in a more effective and a faster way. The truth is that the amount of content that is being generated in the world is so much that it's impossible for humans to be able to translate or interpret all of this content. So we have to use technology and innovation in order to accomplish that. We believe that communication is the key for good relations. We also understand that miscommunication or no communication is also a key ingredient for conflicts, and conflicts at all levels, between individuals and even between nations. So we relay a lot on number 8 and 9. We will speak. I would like to speak more in a moment about how how important it is to give all the tools for this particular industry and how it affects our entire world as a whole.
To switch this on, you can hear me. Okay, cool. Hi, thanks Ben for introducing us, and Theo. So I have two hats on here. So I'm here as a lecturer to my wonderful students here. And in higher education, we see in the UK, so we are from University of Westminster, that one of the key challenges that we're facing is for our students to actually find meaningful employment. And we understand that education is quite important, but we also know that it's not enough. And we know that much of the issues that our youth these days deal with have to do with the economic structures that we live in. So we can keep telling them that are you qualified enough? Do you have enough knowledge? Do you have enough skills? But if the economy is not there to provide the jobs that they need, that's a major issue that we need to deal with. At the same time, my research is, I focus on the Middle East and North Africa, a region of the world which has a really dynamic economic structure. And importantly, it has a hugely young population. And added to that, this is a really highly educated population. So across the Middle East and North Africa region, you have some of the highest rates of youth attending university globally, in fact. Yet, what you see there is a situation where young people, they cannot find the jobs that they want. So we have what they call this phenomenon of jobless growth. And then on top of that, decent jobs. So that's the next step. So not only kind of accessing jobs, but even like having nice, good, productive, decent types of employment. So that's a major challenge that we're facing with, and it's not an abstract challenge, because it's that which creates instability. We saw in 2009, starting from a country in North Africa, Tunisia, it was the youth who came onto the streets and protested against the decline in their livelihoods and their inability to get jobs. And essentially, they were questioning the economic system, which had made some people really rich and left many behind. And so that's where kind of my research focuses on, to try and understand, okay, how do we go about this? It's a really big challenge. We are dealing with hundreds of millions of people. How do we go about creating jobs and working on parallel policies in terms of education, labor markets, legal systems, and the welfare system? Thank you.
So we heard, Laura, you talked a bit about policy, the importance of policy, some of the things that you're working on as it relates to academia, bridging the corporate world. David, you touched on breaking down your work and what you do, breaking down barriers for communication, and that can help, facilitate decent work as well. And Sahar, some of the big picture policy considerations in youth and what your work does and ties into that. So it makes me sort of wonder, let's be futurists for a minute and look at technology. So the world now is 90% cell phones, 90% plus. That was not the case 10 years ago. We see rapidly evolving technology. And I just want to ask a simple question of, and it's open to whoever wants to chime in first, and let's have a little bit of a conversation with it as a panel. Where does the role of technology play in this, and what are the opportunities and challenges that come along with it?
I can start if it's okay. When I started this in this business 27 years ago, most of the translations were done by humans without any assistance of technology. At around that time, there started to be some technology that assisted translators to be able to create memories and create more consistency as they were translating any type of content. At the time, technology wasn't well embraced because there was the feeling like that technology was going to replace the translators. However, as they were using it more and more, technology became their best friend, and they were able actually to increase not just their output, but also their income too. And technology has been evolving. However, translators that have not have access to technology have become obsolete. And it's very sad because these are people that were well educated, trained, but because they didn't have access to technology, they were not able to stay competitive. So innovation is very important. Technology is super important too. But I believe that more important than that, or as important, is the access to this technology and access to everyone, not just to some. I have noticed that access sometimes is not as easy to access, I guess, for countries that are in like Latin America or Africa. Nevertheless, we need these people. We work in a 24/7, 365-day world where communication is happening every single moment at all levels. And in our business, for example, it's not like I can tell a client, oh, I can only help you during these business hours of 8 to 5. The clients expect, hey, I need your help at any given moment because that's when I really need you, and the translators are needed then. So for that, of course, somebody here in the United States, in this time zone, I cannot ask, hey, can you work at 2 o'clock in the morning? It is better to have people in different time zones, but all of them have to be at the same equal grounds, in the same level, with all of the access to the technology tools in order to produce the reliable quality service that clients expect. So I work with about 4,000 linguists around the world in all time zones, and for me, it's crucial for all of them to have all of the tools in order to do the job that they are required to do.
David, something that you said that is very important is to give access to everybody to technology. That is absolutely essential. Businesses, they have a big responsibility, researchers, in developing the technology and applying the technology and providing that technology to everybody. For instance, the financial sector has a big responsibility in providing financial services to everybody. We have noticed how with the lockdowns and with the COVID-19, unfortunately, we were isolated, people were isolated, and we had access to our financial services online. So a key element will be for all the population to have access to the internet, which is something that, well, a majority of the world population has access to the internet, but still there is inequality in least developed countries. If we think about that, there is still 1/4 of the population in rural areas that they don't have access to the internet, and therefore they're excluded for many essential services that are really necessary for the economic development. So we should give recommendations to develop policies and for the interaction between governments, the financial community, businesses, in order to provide those services to those people that are excluded from the system.
I'd like to follow up with that and say, who's doing it best? When you look out abroad, you know, David, you mentioned, okay, I have people in all time zones. This is providing decent work for those people as well. You know, we heard recently that Salesforce is now taking a similar strategy of having people spread out in every time zone. But maybe they, you know, who's really embracing this, you know, in the best way, or who stands out as an example of sort of having that decent work spread out a little bit and being really inclusive? Like who's a good marker for that?
Of course, the developed countries, you know, like the United States and European countries, they're very good at this. A lot has to do with what Chich was just saying, that is access to something as basic as internet. And unfortunately, there is a good portion of the world that don't have access to the internet. In Latin American countries, I am originally from Peru. That's my native country. And I can tell you that in Peru, for example, there's a good portions of the country and communities that don't even have access to internet. And if they don't have access to internet, that means that they don't have access to education. And if they don't have access to education, they don't have access to opportunities for work. And if they don't have the opportunities to work, then they're going to stay in poverty. It's a vicious circle, basically, that is hard to get out. And it's something so basic that you can just have, like the internet. There are other things, of course, that you can have. But as far as who is doing the best, as I mentioned, I think those developed countries. There are some countries, however, that are not as developed, but they understand this concept, and they focus at least on those basic things that are needed, especially like in Asia, I can say. But we have long ways to go.
I hear, you know, a lot of conversation about, you know, we think philosophically about what things have to happen. Internet is a core theme we're sort of pulling out of, you know, people will be left behind from decent work if they do not have access to internet. A lot of us are in let's say a privileged status, we have decent work. Some of us do. Some of the people who are listening to this are going to say, okay, I have a decent job. I'm settled. Why should this matter to me in my life? Because I could tell you, a lot of people are managing, other situations outside of work, and they're like, I've got my job. Why prioritize this sort of philosophical framework or thought process? What does that mean? Because what we see oftentimes is a lot of people looking at the profit line, or a lot of businesses, or a lot of people just thinking about their own individual lives. How to take that out and say, why think outside of that for a minute and think about decent work for all? What would you say to that?
I think it's quite difficult to think that if one part of the population is privileged and the other part is not, that you're going to have a stability, because we're talking about inequality, and I don't think history has shown that any country is going to have lasting peace and stability if one portion of the population is left behind. And I think I go back to the story of Tunisia, and Tunisia had a leadership for 25 years, Ben Ali, who was in power and had enriched the entire system around him, the cronies around him. And essentially the 2009 revolution meant that the 23-year-old rule was overthrown in 28 days. And none of it was left behind. So I don't think you can have lasting peace. I want to also go back to the question you were asking about technology. And I'm going to be a little bit more, what's the word? Maybe just put caveats into the conversation a bit. So one, and I think we'll come back to this later when we're talking about decent work, I think technology can also be a threat to decent work when it comes in the form of automation. I think that's a whole discussion which we need to be aware of. And how do we protect people? There's benefits which comes with it, but also there's a lot of perils attached to that. Second, technology access is absolutely important, and I totally agree. But access is confined by patents. So it's one thing to say that developing countries need to have access to technology, but most of the technology which makes a huge difference to changing the structures of production, access to sort of services, etc., are heavily patented. And then I want to finish on a note about example of where we can learn from it. And I think sometimes we need to sort of look elsewhere for these examples, and some of the best practices are not so much the sexy technologies. So I want to bring the example of mobile money in Kenya. It's called M-Pesa. This was set up in 2007. Kenya has a population of 53 million people. The largest telecom company in Kenya is called Safaricom. And they identified a problem. What was the problem? A lot of people didn't have bank accounts. So they could not save their money, they could not make payments, they could not take out payments and make transactions. And that was super important to people's empowerment, especially women, but everyone. So they said, how do we do this? How do we create a system where people can do that while they don't have access to smartphones? This is 2007, and still today, many people in Kenya don't have access to smartphones. So we're talking about basic Nokia phones. So they created this system whereby you, as a person living sort of even in a super rural area in Kenya, with your small smartphone, you can right now send money to me sitting here in Utah. And that's incredible. It's a very simple technology. And it's actually the best case study of mobile money in the world, M-Pesa. And it came from understanding the local context and coming up with a solution which is super inclusive. And it doesn't mean that you have to have access to Starlink, but actually to a simple smartphone. And that has become the solution to inclusive finance. And now many countries are trying to follow that. So right now, Afghanistan is also using M-Pesa, Tanzania is using M-Pesa. So right now, globally, 50 million people in Asia and Africa are using that system to provide inclusive finance.
That's great. Anything to add, Laura?
Yes, in regards of the decent and economic growth and decent jobs, I will say that as a consequence of the pandemic, the unemployment rate increased dramatically globally. And that implies more million people unemployed. But that unemployment rate is being unequal, as you were mentioning before, North Africa represents one of the highest unemployment rates in the planet. But also, this affects more women. So here we need to call for action to businesses, for instance, because it's what I am more related to. So businesses, they have a say. We can do something on this respect. We can do something to fight against youth unemployment, which also represents a big portion of the global unemployment. So youth is our future. We need to educate youth, and we need to provide them with decent works. Also, we don't have to forget people with disabilities, that they also have many difficulties to get access to decent jobs. And as a consequence of the pandemic, well, they are having more difficulties. So businesses, they can provide, and they can do a really good job. And before, you were asking, do we have examples of good business leaders? Yes, we have really companies that they are doing great good for society. Let's think about Patagonia, that now is in the news, right? And we want more Patagonias in the world, and more examples of really great business leaders that are doing a great job in providing decent jobs and doing great for economic growth, sustainable economic growth.
Great. And David, I also have to say before you speak, the reason you're on this panel is because you're a good example of this, and we want to highlight that. And so I need to bring that to the attention of the audience as well, of all the great work that you've done in this realm.
The question to me is why should I care, or why it matters to have opportunities for others. I can think about, hey, I'm doing very well, and my family is doing okay too. So really what is happening outside my community, outside my family, or even outside my community is not important. But the truth is that with that mentality is not sustainable. Perhaps it's okay for the next few years, but the future will not hold. I was just going to give you a quick example of this. We have many translators who are in the United States, and we also have many more even outside the United States. We pay all of them about the same, and we are not thinking about, hey, because you're in the United States or because you're in England, I should pay you more because it's more expensive where you live. We pay just based on qualifications, expertise, and they should be rewarded equally. And I am a firm believer on that. Yes, perhaps those that live in countries where it's not as expensive to live, they are enjoying perhaps a higher pay. But the truth is that these people, they are taking care of their parents, they're taking care of the sisters' children, and they are doing a lot of things in the communities too. So the impact is not just for this individual; it's for a whole family in many cases. And because of that, they are able to afford even to help their kids or a nephew to go to school and to learn also the skills that they need. And perhaps they are going to be the next, in my case at least, the next translator that we'll be using in the future. Even if I cease to exist, if I were to die, still, we need that. This is not a world that is going to end in 5 years, or at least we should not have the mentality. So for me, it's a matter of sustainability, like the title of this event is, and it's easily exhibited, and I see it on a daily basis in what I do.
Great, thank you. I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience for questions. I want to get a little maybe academic or central banker-ish here, and and ask a question. The UN recently came out and warned some countries about these interest rate hikes. We talked about the pandemic and some of the unemployment issues there, maybe how some countries are affected more than others through the pandemic. We see the US Federal Reserve taking the lead on increasing rates, and other central banks following. We see some ramifications of that happening real time now, and the UN warning against some of those, that this may cause some economic troubles ahead. I wonder if you can speak to maybe your perspectives on that warning, or what you see as a result of this action taking place.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. Yes, these increases in interest rates, they imply a risk in the economy. All this inflationary situation that we are having are putting our economies at a lot of risk, because our salaries, we have to pay, everything is more expensive, and is dramatic bad, especially for emerging economy, least developed countries. The situation is more dramatic. Thinking about countries' debts and raises in interest rates, this means that economies are at a high level of risks. So the United Nations is recommending globally to implement, again, I come with the policies to provide some kind of relief to these countries that they need to pay back their debts, and with the interest rates raising, that is not sustainable. It's totally unsustainable. So it is a difficult situation, the one that we are living right now, globally, with the conflicts worldwide that we have. A huge amount of refugees, people that are suffering the consequences of scarcities in many commodities, and the inflation in the prices of the energy. So all this situation is dramatic, and the increases in interest rates can have dramatic consequences, especially for least developed countries at the time of giving back their debt. So this can put them at a very high level of risk.
Thank you, Laura. So maybe you've covered developing countries and emerging economies. I'm going to focus on the developed countries now, because I think sometimes some of these problems are also quite important in the places we live in the Western world as well. So I use the example of the UK, since we're coming from there. So we've had like the highest hike in interest rates in UK's history, in fact, happening over the past few weeks because of the new government that we have in place. And this happens ironically at a time where there is a cost of living crisis, really high levels of inflation in the UK economy, about 11-12%, which is unheard of. So the response has been, the textbook economics of the central bankers is that, okay, we have inflation because people are spending too much money, we need to give the incentive for them to save money. In the textbook, it makes sense, but only if people have savings, which they can then earn interest on. So at the moment, what that is translating into is that the person who already has to pay a lot more for everything else in their daily life, now they have to pay high levels of mortgages and their kind of interest on their loans. So that's the basic economic problem. Now, what is the solution to that? Because that's clearly not going to be sustainable. This is clearly going to make lives a lot more difficult for people. And when we talk about decent work, in the context of a developed country like the UK, decent work also means that you have a wage that you can live with. And now the solution, which of course the governments are hesitant to go with, is that if you have a situation where people cannot afford to buy things, their real incomes have gone down, right? So your incomes haven't kept up with inflation. So First thing would be for wages to increase. Of course, no one is going to do that. Second thing is for government to step out and subsidize certain products, nationalize things, even temporarily. We feel shocked when we hear the word nationalizing or the government's intervening, because that's not what the central bank textbook tells us. But it seems governments are comfortable doing that when it comes to bailing out banks, for example, in 2008 and 9 financial crisis. But when it comes to actually citizens suffering, it becomes more of a kind of an ideological question for them. So intervention is not seen as something natural, whereas it should be. And I think this is what we're going to see in the I think it's going to be quite unsustainable to have these high levels of interest rate, because it's really kind of affecting people in their pockets. And it depends on how people will react. And we were talking with my students about this before, of let's see what the public reaction would be, and that could jolt governments into action about how to respond to this. Thanks.
Laura, go ahead.
There's something, yes. I think we need to rethink about the whole system. We've been taught at university that our economies, they need to grow, and that growth model is being doing through debt. Businesses, they need to engage with debt because that is really good for the business. These are the economic theories that we have learned in the classroom, and that is totally unsustainable. This growth model does not work with the debt. What happens right now, that businesses, they have a high level of debt, they put the businesses at risk as interest rates, they are growing. That implies a lot of risk. So we did a research with my colleagues in zero debt corporations that they don't have any level of debt. They just use their resources. They don't ask for more. And I think that is totally sustainable financial policy, and we could replicate this to countries. Debt is not sustainable. Look at what is happening right now. So that is putting our economies at a huge level of risk, and our companies as well. So I think we need to rethink about the whole system.
Right, David, anything to add to that question?
Yes, from the business perspective, one of the most important things for businesses is access to capital. If you don't have access to capital, it's going to be very difficult to sustain your business. And what is happening right now, not just here in the US, but around the world, like it has been mentioned, is that access to capital is becoming more and more prohibited. And even if you are able to have access to capital, the interest rates are so high that it makes it impossible to become profitable, and which is the main reason why you are in business to begin with, to become profitable. And so it's again is something unsustainable, like you have been saying. There is if we don't have business generating more income, that means that they're not going to be able to employ people, and if people are not being employed, then there is going to be an economic crisis. This is the way how everything works. People need jobs, and if you don't give what the businesses need to give jobs, then we don't have a sustainable economy, and that is an entire war.
So what I'm hearing, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is we're almost in a defensive posture now on thinking about decent work and thinking about both from the private sector and from governments, because the debt sort of is a huge risk right now for emerging companies and even developed companies to think about what is that infrastructure if you're thinking about funding the things that we talked about, like internet, for those who may not have it. Now that cost has just gone up. That capital is tightened for government, similar for businesses who are thinking about it being innovative and not trying to tighten up their budgets and just do the profit line thing, but think more broadly and inclusively. That can become a lot more difficult under these circumstances.
some of the policies or the strategies the central banks or governments are creating nowadays are in disalignment with what really is needed, especially when it comes to businesses. You mentioned a little bit about that, and we need to align things again to make a sustainable economy.
To see the growth come out of that, because if you get the economic growth, then you can sort of hedge some of these negative aspects as well.
Correct.
So, all right. Well, this has been great discussion, and I'm sure the audience has some really great questions for us as well. We've got about 15 minutes or so that we'd like to open it up and invite any questions from the audience. I don't know how or if it's possible to take them online, but at least here in person. If you'd like to ask a question, I believe we have somebody from UVU who can hand you a mic. And on the stand in the corner. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so if you can make your way over here if you have a question for our panelists, that would be great.
Don't be shy.
And we ask that you use the microphone because we do have people attending online who will want to hear the questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the great panel. We have learned a lot what you have shared. So mine is just a quick question. What is the solution mostly to the poorest countries and to be able to sustain? And the unemployment is so high. So what is the solution? What are you thinking?
It's a softball. Go ahead.
I can start. I'm basically going back to what I mentioned at the beginning is giving access and for governments to create partnerships with other countries where perhaps are more developed and create these alliances that can help not just the one country that has these needs, as you have mentioned, but also by helping that country, they can also help other countries, including the one that need helping you. So I believe also that there is a responsibility from the private sector too. This is not something that governments should be taking the full responsibility, but also private sector should be also creating these type of partnerships. The government plays a big role for sure, but individuals and the private sector also. We live in a globalized economy nowadays, and the world is becoming more and more flat. So I believe that educational institutions, private businesses, they can play a very big role if they were to partner together and create alliances.
And I'm glad you mentioned, David, academic institutions. It's the Why It Matters conference and focusing on that. And academia, we see oftentimes bridges that gap sometimes between businesses and people or governments, and it's great at bringing people together, hence the importance of this conference as well. Laura, were you going to add something? Oh,
if I can follow up on that very quickly, one of the things that when I came here to the United States 28 years ago, that I really love was education. Here in the United States, education is the big equalizer. And that is what we need also in other countries as well.
Thank you.
Quickly, if any of us knew the answer to that, I think no one here would be here, basically. I don't know where we would be, but definitely. I think maybe that's a bit part of the problem. I don't think there is a solution. Kind of one-off solution. If you think about developed countries, it took them hundreds of years to develop. So I don't think we need to set our expectations kind of right. There's a lot of pressure that, okay, what's the solution? Let's get it done quickly, aid, infrastructure, etc. But one thing that I would say is that we can, I think, and it's at the back of what my colleague here was saying, it's very important for us to think about issues from a variety of dimensions. And I say that because we didn't quite discuss infrastructure and industry here. Because sometimes someone comes to you and says, okay, the solution to your country is that you need more roads and you need more infrastructure. I mean, that's the buzzword right now. Everyone wants to invest money in cement. Whereas then you see all these white elephant projects everywhere, which are not being used for development. So it needs to be, we need to have more of a genuine kind of bottom-up approach to it for those of us who are from different parts of the world, to make sure that the processes of decision-making take into account people in a genuine way in decision-making about what development should look like. It should not look like sort of, there is no one solution for every country in the world. And also define it in the context of your country and define those solutions, learning, first of all, from who's done better in that country and then building on that. And of course, other countries in the world as well. But I think it needs to be a genuine bottom-up approach.
And it's an inclusive aspect that keeps coming out as a theme in this panel as well. Laura, did you want to say something?
Yes, the question is very important. What can we do to solve these problems in many countries? What can we do? Maybe there is not a single solution, but yes, many different things that we can do. And what I think is my opinion is that businesses, they have a huge responsibility. Businesses, they have a huge responsibility because there is lots of foreign direct investment in your countries. And that foreign direct investment comes from corporations, global corporations. So those corporations, they need to rethink, like the Business Roundtable statement just 1 year ago, redefine the goal. What is the purpose of a corporation? Until a couple of years ago, it was to maximize shareholders' value. No, that's not. No. Companies, as you said, they need to make money in order to be able to provide jobs. Yes, they need to make money, but not at the expense of society, like Michael Porter said in his theory. But giving back to society, part of what they are getting, being responsible with the environment, providing decent jobs, and building up community, they have a huge responsibility. So I think that businesses, they can do a lot to be part of the solution. Maybe they are not going to be isolated, giving the single solution. Then it needs to be coordinated with policies, eradicating corruption, which is another huge problem. And I could be talking for.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's great. And let's ask for another question from the audience.
Oh, well, hey, great panel. Just a quick question. You know, I've traveled quite a bit in the world, but one of the things that I've seen is lack of trust in economic systems, lack of trust in economic institutions. Now, it's how do we improve that trust of people, especially in underdeveloped countries, to move forward, and what's the role of government? You mentioned corruption. So anyways, I would like to ask that question and get your opinions.
Okay, that is a very important question. Unfortunately, there is no country in the world that is free from corruption. Corruption is in every single country, and that is a huge, huge barrier to economic development. We have the fantastic job that is Transparency International is doing globally in reporting corruption, and unfortunately, no country free from that. But of course, we have a rank of countries where most clean countries, the Nordic countries, North European countries, that they have less corruption, better political systems, and things are working much better. So, yes, I think that we should encourage the collaboration, globally, multilateralism, in order to eradicate or fight against that corruption that is not letting those countries evolve and develop, because that is a huge barrier for economic development. And if you look at the map, it's really terrible to see how corruption is affecting those countries and it's not letting them develop. I think that is a very important barrier, and we should do more. We should work more towards this, like paying bribes. Why companies do they pay bribes? That should be eradicated, but still it happens. And that is a huge problem. It shouldn't happen. Even though we have regulations, but regulations, they are not always implemented. So we need those regulations, but we need a system that really looks for the reinforcement of those regulations, compliance. It doesn't happen because we have a world with different political systems, so we also need to reinforce those political systems in those countries that they need. So there, from my point of view, there has to be the collaboration among all the sectors. We cannot do this alone. It has to be a work of all. Consumer behavior. I am not going to buy these clothes because it's €2. This is something that I always tell my students. How are you going to buy this T-shirt for 2 years, a cotton T-shirt? What is behind that? Behind that, there is something that is really wrong. So we cannot do that. So.
Thank you. Yeah, so thinking about the products you buy as well. Sahar, did you have something to add?
I'm going to keep it very brief because there's someone else who wants to ask a question, and I want to give the floor more to the audience. But just on the issue of trust, I think it's a very important point. And what I would say is that how do we go about it? I think it's also our thinking about what should constitute an economic relationship and development. And correct, I think it's many parts of the world right now are questioning our economic system. It's not out there. We've just done that here. And I think the response to that is that, okay, so there might be a reason why that trust is not there. And let's question that and let's have a discussion about it. Let's understand why that trust is not there, why questions are being asked. And it's only from that understanding and from that discussion and all of us being equal partners in that discussion, I think that's very important. So it's not just developed countries and developing countries and kind of policies going into one direction. I think that sort of discussion and understanding the reason why that trust isn't there, and also maybe then there needs to be for some tweaks here and there, or some major changes in some cases. But I think it's actually healthy to have, we can change it rather than thinking of it as lack of trust, that, okay, maybe there are shortcomings and we need to understand them and address them.
If I can even take a personal privilege as a moderator to tie this in as well to what we're doing here, you know, you hear this from the UN. We're in Utah right now. There's a lot of conceptions about what, or preconceptions about what the UN is, you know, what they're about. And, you know, the conference that was held here a couple of years ago in 2019 actually broke down some barriers just by being present and communicating. So this example happens on a large scale with an organization like the UN, in a place like Utah, in a conference like this. It happens between businesses and government, academia and government as well. So this is a great example as well to that collaboration, that discussion, challenging some of these issues. So thank you. We're going to take another question. And it may be good for our panel as well, if you could state your name and organization. And sorry for those of you who asked questions before that I didn't ask that.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I have another simple/complicated question. In the one hand, for sustainability, we need more, for businesses, we need more consumer, okay? For example, car companies are trying to convince Nigerian people, Indian people to follow American lifestyle, 3 or more car for every family. At the same time, this against sustainability of the environment. What do you think about these paradox? At the same time, we need more consumer at the same. The second question is about social businesses. What do you think about social businesses and the role of making a balance between businesses and human values and sustainability? Thank you so much.
David, can I volunteer you to go first on this one?
When it comes to the role of the government and their interaction with business, what I believe is that the the best way the government can help businesses is by staying out of their way. And that is really what it is. And I also believe that imposing regulations like a certain percentage of your income have to go for social impact projects. I think mandating, obligating is not conducive to a free enterprise. I would prefer to have businesses on their own to come up with a conclusion that, hey, you know what, it is in order for me to stay in business and for me to recruit more people, I need to be a good neighbor. I need to be a good contributor to society. But I have to come out that on my own. I think that the invisible hand will take care of those things because what happens is if I am not, I will probably become obsolete too. People probably don't want to work for me. Our clients probably don't want to do business with me because I don't have any type of social responsibility. But that's something that businesses have to come up with their own conclusion and have to be responsible, but not because the government is mandating. That is how I feel.
Laura, a lot of your research touches on this very topic and through accounting as well, correct? And so maybe you want to provide some perspective from your research on this topic as well.
Yes, I will add first something to your deliberation in terms of, I understand your point of view, but I also think that the governments, they need to provide a huge support to businesses in order to be able to be more sustainable, like policies to implement regulations in terms of facilitating the path towards a more sustainable economy, providing maybe aids, subsidies, or those kind of things, that there is a need for the government to take an active role. And your question, Ben, in terms of my research in accounting, I will say that one very, very important point is that we need a system to account for sustainability. We need a harmonization system, like we have the international accounting standards that they focus on financial statements. We need to have a global harmonized system in terms of sustainability. Before we were talking about trust, so we have a problem with greenwashing, companies that they are telling us that they are sustainable, they are doing great, but now we know that not always. There are some companies that are using this in order to hide policies, and therefore I think accounting in this sense needs to have a big reform and adapt to this and provide harmonization and really the fair view of what companies are doing in respect of sustainability.
I love this big thinking, transitional, this is what's coming. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll be wrapping up. If you could state your name and who you're with.
Good morning. My name is Bill Hunter, and I'm with Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And my question is very brief. What is the role of universal basic income in achieving goals 8 and 9?
Interesting question.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think hugely important. So for those of you who don't know what is universal basic income, UBI, it's basically a system whereby there's an acknowledgement that every citizen qualifies by default by being a citizen to a certain basic level of income, which guarantees their kind of basic livelihoods. I think it's hugely important, particularly in the context of automation and the increasing use of sort of artificial intelligence and what impact that is going to have on jobs. I mean, we were talking about the very real impact of it. For those of you who are interested, the World Economic Forum's statistics on how many jobs are actually in danger, not again in developing countries, but also in emerging and developed countries. Now, one of the responses to that, one of the policy responses is that, okay, so we have, I mean, just to put it very simply, artificial intelligence coming and taking over some of the jobs. Now, what happens to those people's jobs? And here is where then the policy response needs to be kind of quite intersectional. One of it is education, so our education sector needs to be a lot more dynamic. It needs to offer opportunities where it's not about a matter of you graduating and moving on, opportunities for reskilling and upskilling, etc. later on in your life. Economic policies, of course, but also welfare policies such as universal basic income can be quite important in terms of ensuring that if a person is out of their choice, that are living or losing their jobs to AI, that they are guaranteed a certain standard of living. Now, the response to that, and in some countries in the world, they have it. The Scandinavian countries are a good example of that. But it's hugely expensive. And I think that's the problem with it, that you want to protect people's livelihoods, essentially, but how do you raise the money for that? How do you afford it? And I think this is where I'm going to tie it into the discussion of the last question, that I have to kind of agree more with Laura and push that, sort of maybe take that one a step further and say that this is where businesses can play a huge role, but you also need the government, I believe, to some extent, to make sure that a section of that profit is distributed through mechanisms such as UBI and is provided to the others, because the invisible hand of the market, I mean, we can have a whole conference on that, but it requires a slightly more visible hand from time to time to make sure that actually that distribution happens, maybe not even immediately for immediate distribution, but actually pockets of it to be there to be used for later on if we need UBI to become a serious policy in a country. I mean, the most progressive countries in the world have it. So that means that there is a good reason for everyone to think about it. But of course, the costs are prohibitive, and it also requires government intervention, which is a bit uncomfortable for a lot of economies to accept. But nevertheless, that's something that we need to think about quite seriously, and bringing the business in that dynamic way where the government can then sort of determine that some of, as I said, some of those economic contributions from the businesses could go towards protecting people, and then in return, those people will contribute to the business. They can then consume, or they can become sort of employees in those businesses in return. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. David, do you want to respond to that? No? What I'm hearing here is, okay, there are, also consider the carrot versus the stick. What are regulations versus incentives, and are we having conversations with our businesses about what's best? Because oftentimes we can just get out the sticks and start pointing fingers, and it may not be a productive end, and it'll be perhaps less of a conversation towards the end that we're all seeking. So, David?
All right, nice working. I think the government, what I was trying to say by government staying out of the way of businesses is because if you start to put too many regulations and too many obstacles, then businesses are not going to be able to survive, number one, or to sustain. And then you are creating basically, again, exclusivity. Only those that can meet those requirements are going to be able to be in business. And what we are trying to do is create inclusivity, where you basically, everybody is free to be able to open a business. And in fact, the way that we work is that we want more businesses, actually. More businesses is better. It's not the other way around, where less businesses and creating something like monopolies is really the direction to go. No, I want that, or at least how I believe, is that we want the complete opposite to that. Free enterprise is really the solution. And this country specifically have been famous or have been good for creating wealth creating jobs and everything, is the largest economy in the world because of that. And I think some countries that are perhaps some of the poorest are the ones that have the highest regulations, and it makes it almost impossible for somebody to become part of the business society. They have to, basically, they become informal. They don't exist. They're phantoms, because there is no way that they can be part of a government-regulated society.
Well, and SDG 9 focuses on innovation as well, and if you're hampering that down with regulations, you're constricting that ability for competition, free enterprise, that ability for companies to grow. And so, like you're saying, that may incentivize monopolies or oligopolies or things like that in an economy. So I want to say thank you to our panel. This has been a great conversation. Thank you, guys. And if we can give them a round of applause from the audience as well, thank you. Thank you. Wonderful job. And thank you to the audience as well, those attending virtually and here in person. It was a great conversation and great to have you ask these wonderful questions as well. Thank you.